Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Heather Noonan, the Vice President for Advocacy with the League of American Orchestras, here to just very briefly thank you for coming into the room. Thank you to this panel for talking on the topic of resourcing diversity. This is a real opportunity to continue the thread of the conference theme on the richness of difference, looking at it through a funding angle. And just the only thing that I have to say before handing it over is that we know how much funders love evaluation. And so we want to encourage you to evaluate the session at the end of it. So when you look into your conference app for this session or others that you attend, please do respond to us with your feedback, things you gathered that were helpful to you, how you'd like to continue this conversation, and it helps to inform next year's conference and beyond. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. And welcome, everybody. I'm Marian Godfrey. I'm a member of the League's Board of Directors, and I am a recovering grant maker after many years in Philadelphia. And I'm delighted that you're here for this session. In yesterday's plenary, we heard Earl Lewis, Maren Alsop, and Alex Lang make eloquent arguments for the moral responsibility, my words, not theirs, and the existential necessity of nonprofit arts organizations to embody as well as serve their communities, and for the great artistic benefits that accrue when that happens. In this session, we hope to engage with you in a discussion about what orchestras need in order to resource your work on diversity, equity, inclusion, at a level that can feasibly make change that you seek in your organizations, and how funders can help. We acknowledge the anxiety that exists in the field about the prospect of losing out, being excluded from funding if you don't get on the diversity bandwagon. And we acknowledge also that there's some reality to those concerns. But I think we can affirm for all of us up here that grantmakers want and need to find ways of encouraging and supporting organizations to develop a readiness to do the hard work of change. And so we really want to hear from you where you are with this and what you need from your funding partners. We realize that a lot of League organizations are smaller in size, and that the issues for them may be different than for large organizations. And I want to start just by asking you to put your hands up in response to a couple of questions so that we can kind of get more of a specific sense of who's in the room and frame our discussion with you. So to provide that context, could you please raise your hand? And here I'm going to ask if you're a small organization or medium-sized or large, and I guess I want to say I don't really understand the League's tiering system, so I just want to ask you how you self-identify. Who self-identifies as being in a small organization? A medium-sized organization. So a lot of you are medium-sized. A large organization. Okay, that's a pretty good representation. How many of you think your audiences currently reflect the demographics of your communities? How about the musicians on your stage? So not too many. How many of you are concerned that you're not doing enough to diversify your organizations, your musicians, your audiences? And that's why you're here, and that's great to see you. How many of you have diversity committees on your boards? That's good. And how many of you are confused about what to do and how to talk about it and what language to use? Yeah, thank you. I believe that the greatest challenges we face to build up leadership commitment to the urgency of this work, and then to find the time as well as the money to take it on. Our panelists will talk about what strategies for change might look like, starting with efforts that are not necessarily expensive. We hope you'll share your own experiences with this work and with us and with each other so that we can all continue to get better at it. So let me introduce our panel, and they will talk in this order. Janet Brown is the president and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts and has led GIA's work on racial equity and social justice as a priority for arts grantmaking. She's a nationally known consultant, speaker, and teacher. Edwin Torres is deputy commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. He was previously an associate director at the Rockefeller Foundation, where his broad portfolio included cultural funding, and was a program officer at the Ford Foundation. So he's a real trifecta up here. Susan Fader has been the program officer for performing arts at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation since 2007 and now serves in that capacity for the Consolidated Program of Arts and Cultural Heritage. As you know, I'm sure, she has been a good friend to music, to composers, to orchestras, and to the League at Mellon and during her previous career. And I refer you to panelist bios that are in the fabulous conference app if you want more detailed information. So Janet, here, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Marian. Good morning, everybody. And in full disclosure, I just have to say that these two folks are currently on my board of directors, so they're my bosses. And Marian used to be president of Grantmakers in the Arts, and so I have to be careful with what I say. We're among friends. Yeah. It is really an honor to be here today, and also a little shout out to the League and to Jesse for their leadership in this area and our strong support for association work and learning together. So it's fantastic. At Grantmakers in the Arts, we started about actually 10 years ago. From the membership, there came a small group that were social justice funders who wanted to meet together, who wanted us as their association to give them space, to give them some ability to connect with each other and to talk about their grant programming. Out of that group came then a real need for the association, for Grantmakers in the Arts, to give them more focus and to figure out if there was something that they together were learning that we needed to share with the greater field. And that's essentially what's happened over the last 10 years. It started with, so our story is really twofold. One is organizational change within my own organization, which is very similar to all of your organizations. I have a board of directors, and I have a staff, and we raise all of our money, and we have to get grants, and so that's how we operate. We're a nonprofit organization. So it's our organizational change, and then how we took that organizational change and helped it to move into, and guided it to move into education for the field. So it was really two steps, and it started with a small group of individuals on our board who were committed to equity and social justice. And not just our board, also our membership. What that group did was they started convening, and at that point, we decided we would hold a thought leader forum, which is bringing together people who have worked in a certain content area and help them advance that agenda. And at that point, the committee who was doing that thought leader forum actually determined that we had to narrow our focus from equity. What does equity mean? It's a little bit like, what does diversity mean? To really say, what kind of equity are we talking about? And where is it that is most important for us to make a change? We determined then that our work would be focused on racial equity in arts philanthropy. Not racial equity in the world, because we can't solve the world's problems, and that's not our job. Our job is to guide and educate grant makers to do the best job they can do. So racial equity in arts philanthropy became our focus. With that, that first Thought Leader Forum became a structural racism training. We brought in the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, who have been working in that educational spot for 30 to 40 years, and did their 2-day training. This was that small group of members and board members. That led to 3 or 4 meetings of that group. That led to beginning discussions at our board meetings about the culture of Grantmakers in the Arts, what we needed to do, what we could help the field to do. That led to eventually, excuse me, a couple of years later, so this group met for 2 years. This is not simple work we're talking about. If it's simple for you, then you have a Band-Aid solution. So I'm just saying, this is the process that we've been through. So then we decided that the entire board agreed that they would do structural racism training. Again, we brought in the same people, People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. There are lots of folks who do structural racism training. What that provided for all of us was a common vocabulary. The board went through that 2-day training. All the staff went through that 2-day training. And what it gave us, and especially for white people like me, it gave us the ability to talk about race, to talk about inequities, to talk about the optics of this country, which are so important in terms of who you are and what you are and how you're defined when you walk into a room. When I speak to groups, mostly I start out now by saying I'm a white woman from a small town in the Midwest, and I'm 65 years old. So all the isms are in that sentence, right? That's like, now you know who I am and where my perspective comes from. And I don't understand the perspective of people who are maybe not white, but I can try. And that's the, understanding our whiteness, understanding white privilege, all of that comes through that training. And so I cannot stress to you enough, if you want to change the culture of your organization, you have to understand the very fundamental things and historic contexts that have gotten us to where we are today, not only with the music industry, but with your communities and the power structures within that community. So training is absolutely imperative. You may not be able to make those decisions for your organization. You may only have one or two allies within your organization that you can begin to talk about that kind of thing with. But eventually you'll find those allies and it will make a difference. We then went on to, and this is 4 years after we started this work, to publishing our Racial Equity and Arts Philanthropy Statement of Purpose, which is on our website, and you can see it there. And along with that will come, we are now defining what we mean by Alana peoples and Alana organizations, which are Asian, Latino, African, Arab, and Native American artists and arts organizations. So organizational change was first imperative. Then we moved into how we can educate everybody else. And what was our biases that we didn't even know that we had that were preventing and giving barriers to talking about this in a more explicit way. Last year, and we just got the results this year, we did a racial equity audit of Grantmakers in the Arts, which is an internal audit of our internal communications and policies and our external programs and communications. So what were the barriers in our hiring practices? What were the barriers in our policies, in our bylaws, in our programs that possibly kept us from including or somehow supporting Alana people? That audit is going to the board in July, so we'll take a look at that. And we're pretty pleased with how that came out. One of the reasons we did it was that we wanted to be a role model for other organizations, to say we are not afraid to learn more about this. We are not afraid to say we've maybe not been where we should have been, and we can do better. And here's how we'll do better. The next step for us is we just have contracted with consultants to find best practices from our membership. And by the way, our membership includes not just private foundations, but public agencies. So state arts councils, the National Endowment for the Arts, and local arts commissions are also members of Grantmakers in the Arts, along with community foundations and corporate funding programs. So we're just not in the foundation world. We straddle this thing between organizations with very different missions. Eddie's organization, which is a government-funded, tax-funded organization whose mission is access and equity, should be. That's what government's supposed to do. They actually have those, ethical principles. And then the Mellon Foundation, which of course is a private foundation who determines its own goals and what they will do with their money. So it's there's a lot of variation there. But I think this idea of first looking at your own organization internally, its policies internally are exactly what you need to do, and also how you bring the board with you. Your board is so incredibly important here. And these are very uncomfortable conversations. If they're not uncomfortable, I'll have to say this too. And I love these sort of sweeping generalizations. If they're not uncomfortable, you're not doing the right work. We had fights at our board. Yeah, we had fights. We had people crying. We struggled But we came to a place where everybody could get behind that statement of purpose, and when you read it, it is pretty darn strong. And it talks about the historic context in this country that have kept people oppressed for years and what we need to do to change it. Okay, so the next step then is to find best practices so that we can create a workshop that we will take out to local funders and talk about racial equity and arts philanthropy in their own communities, and hopefully help them to come up with some solutions about the projects and programs that they could be doing. I salute you in this work. I salute that you are in this room, and totally about the awesome people are, these guys who are actually trying to change programming and change how we look so that our communities can all become more equitable and that everyone can share in the beautiful art forms that you all deliver. Thank you.
Eddie.
Sure. Hi, I'm Edwin Torres from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. So, as Janet pointed out, we're a government agency, and so, being a government agency and being in New York City, and being stewards of our cultural organizations, we support about 900. And when we look at our cultural organizations, ultimately we see people who are committed to public service and who are committed to serving their communities, and who want to continue to do so in the future. And so we look at a nation that's growing increasingly more diverse. And we look at a city that looks like what the nation is going to become. So in New York City, our population is about 67% people of color. And so ultimately, if we want our organizations to survive and to grow and to thrive, we want to make sure they're as positioned as effectively as humanly possible, right? They ultimately want to make sure we're serving the audiences of tomorrow and that we are cultivating the supporters of tomorrow. And in New York City, that is the vast majority of the city's population. So, we looked at some sort of extant research that's out in the field looking at the relationship, largely just based on our own experiences of the field. I come out of 10 years of community arts, running an arts organization down in the South Bronx, and we were looking at the relationship between our sort of staff and leadership composition in our field and our audiences, And what struck us was what seemed to be a relationship between the two. Like, for instance, the American Association of Museum Directors put out a study on the future of museums. And they realized that if you look at museum staff, they look like the country prior to the 60s. And if you look at museum audiences, they looked exactly the same. They were about 10% people of color, right? Staff, audience, almost exactly the same, right? When you control for security guards and maintenance staff. And this is very much what we had kind of experienced anecdotally. And so we said, okay, well, how do we look at this sort of systematically here in New York? And how do we support the field in doing this, right? So we engaged this third-party research firm, paid them with private philanthropy, so we're not actually in contract with this firm, we're not using any taxpayer money for the firm, and the firm does an anonymous aggregated survey of the field, right? And so basically what we've come to find is, in a city that is about 67% people of color, we have a field that's under 40% people of color. This is in New York specifically, right? And then we look at it and it looks very much like the country, not just in terms of composition, like the country in contrast to the city, right? But it also looks like, in terms of the dynamics, where the country is going. So the most diverse cohort in the cultural community in New York City are those that have been hired the most recently, right? Those who have been hired in the past 10 years are probably the most diverse cohort. And it's also probably the largest cohort just because of the nature of job churn, right? So, but this also means where a lot of people are in the cultural community. They're very well represented in the most junior positions, less so in the mid-level positions, less so in senior positions. And this is true of the professional realm in general in America. Seriously, I remember looking at this and just sitting there with all of this data, looking at National Bureau of Labor Statistics information, looking at kind of all that has been quantified out of the tech community, out of Hollywood, out of higher ed, because of all the national dialogue around these issues going on. It looks very much like the dynamics we're seeing out in a lot of the realms of professional endeavor out in America. And we're ultimately looking at, okay, well then, what are effective practices? So we're doing two things, is we're having sort of roundtable discussions and we're having public panels where we're holding up effective practices. We're also bringing in a diversity and equity inclusion firm called Future Work Institute, which is actually in the process of training the city staff for the city of New York around diversity, equity, inclusion issues. Right now, they're beginning to do focus groups of the field in New York City, looking at, well, what's working for you? I mean, of people working in the field. What's working for you? What's not working for you? What would you recommend, that your boss does, et cetera? And we're also looking at ourselves, right? I mean, for a government agency, we're small. I mean, in New York, we're about 65 people, so we're about the size of a police precinct. So, but we're looking at this survey and we're recognizing, people with disabilities, for instance, are about 10% of the population in New York City. There's virtually no information we secured on people with disabilities in our field and none in our staff, We're looking at the issue of people of non-binary, self-identify as being of non-binary gender. Likewise, virtually absent from the field that we can see, virtually absent from our staff that we can see. And this is something that the city of New York is actually looking at. I'm going to non-binary gender training literally the week after next, along with a bunch of my fellow deputy commissioners throughout the city. We're also looking at just this issue of how do you resource this work, right? We've released about $3 million worth of RFPs into the field, looking to resource the field to be able to do this work. We've been very fortunate. We just had a budget handshake 2 days ago. We've secured an extra $10 million for grant making at the agency. This is one of those moments where we're recognizing that while we want to, we came into this saying we want to teach the field, and we're ultimately recognizing we, one, are learning from the field, and two, that the field is honestly best served by learning from one another. We're realizing now increasingly that we're facilitating learning more than anything. So.
Thank you.
Can you hear?
There you go.
Hi, thank you. Just so inspiring to hear from my colleagues. When I joined the Mellon Foundation in 2007, we were in the last phases of a 10-year initiative called the Orchestra Forum that was serving about a dozen orchestras of varying sizes designed to change organizational culture, the relationship between staff, board, and musicians. And when I think to the report that I prepared for our trustees in September of 2008, about 18 months into the job, about 6 weeks before Obama was elected president of the United States, the words diversity and inclusion were nowhere in my report. And having gone back to the reports of that initiative that were done by the orchestras and done by my predecessor, those words don't appear either. So I just want to pause for a moment and think about how far the field has come. We certainly were beginning to talk about community engagement rather than community outreach, and the final Mellon report talked a lot about serving the community, but we hadn't made this leap to really think about what that meant in terms of demography, demographic change, and what our missions should be. In the 9 years I've been at Mellon, we have made a commitment of more than $60 million to orchestras, and we have served more than 30 orchestras, so a major uptick in the numbers of orchestras served, and these are orchestras of all sizes, which I've identified mostly in two large tranches, creation and development of new music, and what I call adaptive organizational practices. And I think the adaptive organizational practices have led to the work that we began in diversity probably 7-8 years ago with support for the Sphinx Organizations Tour, and work that Detroit Symphony was doing and several others. But I want to address Marian's comment about losing out on funding if you don't make this change. 30 orchestras, there are 700 league orchestras. My annual budget of approximately $25 million may seem like a lot, but I am serving orchestras, opera companies, theaters, dance companies, performing arts presenters on college campuses. It's very easy to spend that money quickly. So the initiatives we have supported to date have not been generated because we said that orchestras have to do this or else. They have happened because Trey Devi came to me and said, the Cincinnati Symphony and College Conservatory of Music have an idea we'd like to talk about. And I came to an 8 a.m. breakfast meeting at the Cincinnati Symphony, and there were 5 musicians at the table, along with board and staff representation. And it was so thoroughly authentic an idea and so well thought out that my work was easy. Similarly, when Alan Valentine came last year at a conference and said, I want to talk to you about our cello rondo program. We're going to do this, but we haven't figured out how to fund it. We are working with Vanderbilt University. We want to do X, Y, and Z to identify kids in middle school and offer them private instruction and give them music theory training and get them to summer camps, help them with college preparation. These were, again, so thoroughly thought out at the local level that, again, my job was easy. You all had the privilege of hearing my wonderful president, Earl Lewis, speak to you yesterday. When Earl arrived 3 years ago, he led us through our first strategic plan in the 46 years of the Mellon Foundation. That was an exercise. And the plan is called Continuity and Change. And I think it's mindful of our rich cultural heritages, the values we hold dear, and also the need to adapt and change in a rapidly changing society. It's allowed me to think about pre-college work for the first time at the Mellon Foundation. The MMUF program he described at the keynote yesterday starts at the sophomore level, sophomore and college level. But as you know as well as I do, you can't decide to become an orchestra player when you're a sophomore in college. So our trustees have been very supportive of our moving out, and we made a grant this year to Carnegie Hall for the NYO2. Thank you, Sarah, for that vision. And it's just very exciting to see our trustees understanding these issues and the complexity of these issues, and our need to move backward in our down a level in our thinking. We worry a lot about access and breadth versus depth. We can't do everything. We will be looking for partners, and there, as you know, are not a lot of institutional funders in the orchestra field right now, but we are hopeful that our thinking about these issues will attract a different kind of conversation among funders. I think the other power we have as a funder is non-monetary, and we have a convening power. And bringing together, as we did last December in collaboration with the League, leaders not only of orchestras, but of conservatories, youth orchestras, community music schools, the Sphinx Organization, Carnegie Hall, people that are not necessarily in the same room together, and most importantly, the orchestra fellows that were in Mellon-funded programs, who I hope many of you have had an opportunity to meet over the past couple of days, because we brought them back, and learning from the people in the field. It's very easy for us as funders sitting at a 30,000-foot level with a budget to think that we know it all. We really don't, and it's a very humbling experience to hear the issues of structural racism from the point of view of a fellow that has not only had to make his or her way into the orchestra via an audition, but then becomes an ambassador at the age of 24, 25, being the only person in the room. So we're very hopeful about trying to create a better network, a larger network of fellows, and also of trying to support the pathways and pipelines that will give a critical mass of musicians to populate your orchestras going forward. I could go on to talk about staff and board and audience, but I think that if this is not going to be an attractive field for diverse candidates of staffs or boards, if we don't change our programming and we don't change the makeup of our ensembles. And as Earl said yesterday, this doesn't happen overnight. I think we are talking about a generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, all three of you. You just heard a repeated invitation from Susan for us to hear from you what you know, what you're learning, and what funders need to know in order to be able to support your work. So I'm going to come out in the audience with this mic, and I'm looking for questions or comments. Don't be shy. Yeah.
I'm Sarah with the Eugene Symphony Association in Oregon. My question is kind of, when funders are looking at projects, it's hard, and it struck me when you said this about depth, is to make an impact sometimes, particularly with the amount of funding, and sustaining it, because it's a question of time and long-range commitment, as well as depth. You have to really impact very small numbers, particularly in a community like ours. And sort of how do you frame that to, to funders who are used to larger volumes or numbers? And do you go with a one-moment impression at a youth concert that reaches a large number, or do you go with depth that's 60 people over time? And yeah, I guess that's the nature of it. And the other thing is, it's hard to take a step into this if you know you can't keep doing it. To walk into a community and say, we're interested in what you need and value with regard to music, and only be able to do it one time, you might as well not do it. So that's a concern too.
It's a great question.
Right to the heart of the matter.
It's a great question. I don't like to speak for other funders because I think we all have our own missions and reporting structures to our own boards. But to say we can't do it on a large scale is to avoid the place of starting. And I think everyone has to start from somewhere. Sometimes we get it right. We don't always. One of the grants we made in 2008 or so was to the South Dakota Symphony for their Lakota music project, working with the tribes there. Again, I thought it was a very well thought out project. They were very optimistic about getting local funding, and we had hoped that the Mellon Imprimatur would help them do that. They felt that former Senator McGovern would lead that charge, and that didn't happen. And we made the reluctant decision that if there was no buy-in on the local community, that and there was also change in executive leadership. There were other issues at the time, but we've resumed those conversations now, where the orchestra seems to be in a better place. Because I really regret that very question of leaving something when you have made an initial investment.
Susan, do you regularly make multi-year grants?
Yes, most of our, we do two sorts of grants. We have discretionary grants that we use for planning and exploration, where we can provide seed money. In some instances, that can lead to an implementation grant, and others, we mutually decide it shouldn't go forward. But then most of our grants are multi-year. 3 years are our average, and when we go in, we also go in with the expectation that 3 years might not be enough, and the sort of rule of thumb in-house is that 3 rounds on a project, so sort of 9 to 10 years is an intervention, and then our trustees look for sustainability. And I'm a broken record around the foundation when I say, unlike the higher education institutions, which is the bulk of Mellon funding, you are not churning out a alumni pool on an annual basis with lifelong loyalties to a single institution, and that the organizations in my portfolio have to fight for every dollar every year. So sustainability is a tough issue, but I think, as you heard Earl say with Mellon May's undergraduate program yesterday, that's a 27-year investment.
I also think we have to be careful not to think of this work. I want you to not think of this work, even though that's what this panel is about, in terms of a grant project. This is cultural, organizational change. That means if you want to seriously do this work, you're going to say, here's our goal. Our goal is to provide music, to make sure that there's an audience that's diverse, to make sure that that there's a pipeline for the audience. So whatever you can do in your communities to start building the platform that eventually builds into a program that you might say, this is a Mellon program now, because we have this commitment, because we've made this commitment. Whether it is advocacy that you do in your own K-12 school districts. I mean, there are communities. I'm from the Midwest. I was actually on the South Dakota Symphony Board of Directors at some point, and I know that there are communities there that are 50% Latino now, that weren't 10 years ago, 15 years ago. A lot of it has to do with meatpacking plants. A lot of it has to do with, communities are changing all over. It's not just New York, and it's not just Los Angeles. So even in Eugene, you've got populations that you're not serving, but those populations are going to school. So the best, if you can make a commitment to say, what are we doing, and how inexpensive can it be? Because it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to say we're gonna do something to promote, advocate, change policy so that kids have equal access to some kind of music education. And with that, I want to give a little shout out to Heather Noonan and the League for their work in this area also on a national level. But so I think we have to be careful that this doesn't become one more fad. We've had these diversity discussions before. I've been in this field, we've all been in this field for 40 years, and it, except for Addie, he's this old. But what does it mean in terms of real change as we move forward? Because the world is a whole different place now than it was the last time we had this conversation.
Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Laura from the Seattle Symphony, and I'm really curious. It sounds like the process that you went through at Grantmakers for the Arts in terms of, getting this conversation going and understanding structural racism within your own organization was really powerful. And I'm curious how, now that you've gone through this process with your staff and board, how has it changed your organization? I mean, have you noticed a difference in the new people you might be hiring or the makeup of your board? And how do you keep this conversation going? Do you feel like now that you have the language and the tools that you're able to talk about these issues in a much more kind of open way with the folks in your organization?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we've changed just in the last hire that we did, we changed the language of the job application. We changed where we sent that application to. The 3 women that I interviewed were all women of color because they were the 3 best resumes that I got. So, I mean, that's just one example. The discussions that we have at the board level, I think, are way more sophisticated than it was when we first started. And the board is, and I think another interesting thing is that we used to think about sort of the social justice as one more track, like arts education, like capitalization, like our other focus areas. It is now integrated into everything we do. So this idea of grant making through a racial equity lens, being a symphonic orchestra that has a racial equity lens means that everything you do says, so all of our sessions, for example, when the submissions for our sessions come in for our annual conference, we look at all of them, we send them all to our board committee. We have a racial equity board committee. They look at all of those sessions to give examples of how a session that maybe is about research or maybe is about arts education or about financial health, could it have a racial equity aspect to it, or a panelist, or somebody who would say, yes, but what about the Latino dance company that can't do this kind of development work, or whatever the situation might be. So it's a more integrated, rather than, it's not a program for us. I mean, and that's the goal as we move along. And every once in a while we have to catch ourselves and go, oh. Oh, yes, yes. We need to do that too, because we just, and staff will bring it up. I mean, everybody has this in their minds now. So it's not just me. I don't lead the charge, always. Mostly I do, but no, that's not true. But I will have staff people say, yes, but what about? And I'll go, oh, yeah, thanks.
I just want to add that at Mellon, even with an African-American president and an African-American board chair, this is a work in progress for us. And we've had to work with our HR department, which is led by a Hispanic, to say, no, you just can't use the agency you wanted that you've used for your years for hiring. We need to make open calls. We want to have diverse candidates in the pool for every interview. We've also started across the foundation asking questions about diversity and inclusion in your organization in every proposal request that we send out. It doesn't mean we are not going to fund if the answers are not satisfactory. We are trying to get a baseline for our own thinking and also to open up an opportunity for you to discuss these with your boards. If you're an executive leader, if these are awkward conversations, it may be easier to say, Mellon asked this question, we need to put it on the table. And that's a form of non-monetary work that we hope will advance the field as well.
In the spirit of that also, I mean, if there's one thing that we've experienced has been the issue of giving away some element of your power is a part of the learning process. We use for our grant making a panel process, so like our staff members don't select our grantees, members of the field and members of the community do, and that is a process of handing away some of your power. But when you're also learning to think about things differently, as we're doing, to a certain extent, we have to check ourselves in a way that is not as comfortable as self-identifying as an expert. Instead, self-identifying as a learner, which is a process.
Thanks.
This is also, I just want to add one more thing. That this is also I'm a big. I talk about this a lot. That this is an area that white people need to step up about. For the past discussions that we've had on diversity, I think we can all remember going into some discussion about diversity and some session, and the session was completely full of Alana people and people of color, and there were no white people in the room, and you didn't think as a white person you actually belonged in that room. And so people of color talked to themselves, and then the white people talked to themselves, and now we hopefully have a more open America about this, and we can talk more transparently about it. But as white people, we have to have the right vocabulary and the kind of, particularly liberal white people. So I'll give you this little quote that I oftentimes use that scares people. And that's that in the People's Institute training that we did with the board of directors, there was the white guy who was a trainer, who was a Jewish guy from New York City, fabulous guy, said to us, I would rather talk to the skinheads in the penitentiary, which I do often, who are outwardly racially biased, than to talk to the good white liberal people in this room. I just want you white people to think about that for a second. What are your biases that you don't even know you have? What is that internalized superiority that you don't even recognize because you've never had to? And this is why structural racism training is absolutely essential to move forward in understanding the communities in which you now seek to serve in an authentic manner. So I'm saying that.
I'm so glad you said that. My question really ties into it. My name's Katie. I'm from Kids Notes, an El Sistema program in Durham and Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm now with El Sistema USA also. And we're thrilled to be fueling what I hope to see are tons of diverse musicians in the near future as we have kids beginning to graduate out. But my question is about something I struggle with as a white leader in the El Sistema movement. And we serve kids, and we get a lot of interesting situations where we're working with families and parents and communities from which these kids are from, and our services technically are really for kids to then build them up. And we think a lot about, are we leaving folks behind? What is this like in this family for this next generation to have opportunities that the parents didn't have, the grandparents didn't have? And I just am curious what you're thinking about or what you're encountering as you're working with programs who are trying to do, and I thought what Marian Alsop said the other day, trying to do good but not always doing the right thing, and what that looks like for you, and what success maybe you've seen.
That's a tough one, guys.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, I would say that in New York City, 50% of our grants are actually for arts education.
Yeah, could you speak up more?
Oh, pardon me. I would say that in New York City, about 50% of our grants are for arts education. And we are not the biggest supporter of arts education in New York. The Department of Education actually is. And two things. One is that a lot of the systemic challenges that the cultural community has in terms of engaging a lot of people comes from this issue of what folks, or at least what they identify as the pipeline, right? And that really is an education intervention. I mean, if you're going to take that seriously, right? That's an intervention from jump. But for folks who do that kind of work, what they also find is that's also an education into the lives of their parents fairly often. I mean, a lot of us go, I have 2 kids. A lot of us go to cultural events because we're bringing our children to the cultural events, And so you are, of course, having exactly that experience. You're engaging families of color, I mean, you're not going to be engaging kids in isolation. One, it sounds to me like you're doing the right things in that you're being mindful of power dynamics when you're doing that, right? And 2, you're also being mindful of the systemic nature of that kind of intervention, which it's sort of incumbent upon all of us to do.
And I think you have to approach it with a sense of humility and a willingness to listen and a willingness to learn from your own mistakes and to be forthright about acknowledging those mistakes and course corrections, because that's how we go through life. And it's not a straight linear path with one single solution. And the ability to course correct as necessary is very important.
I'm Michelle Weger from the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. Susan, you mentioned programming when you were speaking, and in the plenary conversation the other day, they were talking about the big red circle that you draw around what we define as an orchestra and what defines an orchestra. And so I'm very interested in how we talk about diversifying programming when 98% of the existing repertoire is by white men, most of them dead.
Commission.
And are there issues not only around commissioning new music, which I think more and more orchestras are doing, which is wonderful, but around styles of music, non-Western influenced music? And I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, great question. Again, I think it comes down to authenticity and knowing your community and trying to get the African American programming out of the month of February, because everybody's figured that out. But I think in San Francisco, which has a large Asian community, there is now a considerable amount of reasonably increased amount of programming from the Chinese composers in the American diaspora over the past years, and there are some wonderful composers that have come out of that. It's always struck me that orchestras look for national composers and prestigious commissions when they're wonderful composers in the community, and I think to look closer to home in your local universities, it's not that hard to find.
Can I just add to that? I think that there's always 2 choices here. One is that your orchestra could remain or be a culturally specific organization, meaning you have white performers performing a white canon for white audiences. No different than the Hispanic dance company or the Latino dance company who has Latin dancers performing Latin art for Latin audiences, right? If that's the case, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you're preserving an art form, right? And that has to be, that's just fine. But if that's the case, then then what we don't want to do is to say, we're going to preserve this art form, but we want to diversify our audience, or we want to diversify so that I'm going to now ask for grants to diversify this group, when in fact there's something amiss about that. So either internally you commit to doing this work, or internally you say, we're not going to do this work because we just want to be what we are, right? So I think authenticity is what it's all about.
When Matthias Tarnopolsky was at the New York Philharmonic, he described that orchestra as being a cross between a museum and a laboratory. And the description has stuck with me because I think it is incumbent upon you to figure out what that balance is within your own institutions. But it's possible for them to coexist.
We have a question back here, and I'll come down to the front there.
All right. Hi, John Keyser, New World Symphony. Janet, you talked about bringing on board consultants and performing an audit. How did you source those individuals? What was the process of making a selection and bringing them on board? If you could talk about that, it'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we for both projects we did an RFP and sent it out to folks that we knew, asked people that we knew who were in the racial equity world to give us recommendations. It was an open process. And I mean, I have lists of those folks that if anybody wants, you can contact me and I would send them to you of people who can do that work. And our list is by no means conclusive either. So,
in the theater field, which is somewhat more advanced or farther along in this work, the facilitator Carmen Morgan is now with Mellon Funding training trainers. So we are hoping to move that beyond theaters in the next couple of years because we need more good people out there helping those that want to be helped.
There seem to be a lot in San Francisco. San Francisco has sort of led the world in this, in our world, I think.
Hi, I'm Audra with the Interschool Orchestras of New York, and previously I've been in New York now, of course. But worked at the NJSO in Newark before this, and we've in both organizations that I've worked on the East Coast. I came from St. Louis before this. I grew up as a white Midwesterner. I grew up on a farm, not in an urban setting at all, and I have a very earnest desire to take on this work, but you're talking a lot about authenticity, and I just want to know what you see as authentic behaviors, because I think a lot of efforts I make, I'm afraid of looking ungenuine and kind of bumbling. What does authenticity look like, and how can I, I'm just speaking very selfishly right now. How can I say I'm being authentic and I really want to do this and I'm invested without, protesting too much, as it were?
I'm just one data point, but I find that for a lot of people, being authentic is being bumbling. The fact of the matter is, so often, so many of us are struggling with issues of how to deal with this, and are oftentimes really feel deep within ourselves a real deep inhibition about doing it because I'm going to say something wrong. I'm going to inadvertently offend somebody who I'm really not looking to offend, who I'm actually looking to engage. And the fact of the matter is, I fairly frequently open up discussions by saying, I'm going to say some stuff that's wrong. You feel free to tell me when I do so, and I'll continue to try and self-correct. But I walk into a lot of discussions just committed to getting something wrong, and being embarrassed for however many minutes I'm going to have to be embarrassed for, because otherwise, speaking as an individual, I can't move forward otherwise.
I also think that. Oh, I'm sorry. Please. I also think as a white woman from the Midwest, and I grew up in a town 2000. The training was imperative to me. So understanding how we can have this conversation as white people the kind of respect and authenticity of which has a lot to do with honoring other people and understanding our internalized biases that we grew up with, because this is a culture that we grew up in. All of those things, and then owning it, just like Eddie said, owning it.
I would also say that you, in 10 seconds, indicated a career path that gives you a legitimacy because of the choices you made, your transparency in identifying where you came from, and your willingness to ask the question means that you shouldn't apologize, but you should listen and ask questions and celebrate those choices. And thank you.
I spent a lot of years apologizing for being from a small town in the Midwest. And feeling inadequate that I wasn't raised in, New York City, and I didn't go to an Ivy League school. And then the hell with it. The older you get, the more you go, oh. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
We can learn from you.
I'm actually from New York City, and recently had the experience. I encountered a possum. And I was petrified, right? This is an animal whose main defense is falling over onto its side, I want to say. And I was so scared because I just never encountered it before.
Hi, Maureen from the New World Symphony. When we think about resourcing this work, in the corporate sector has potentially been thinking about this and dealing with these issues for longer, right? And we have many organizations that have chief diversity officers, and they have affinity groups and all these kind of things. And I think we all know that there's potential there, but I'm wondering if any of you or anyone in the room has successfully sort of leveraged your corporate partners or taken a project to a corporate entity and asked them to help you with this work or let us learn together. I came from the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, and we were thinking about developing a program. We celebrated music from every country in the world. So that helped because we had a platform where our cultural assets were diverse by nature, and we were thinking about, could we develop a corporate training program together with a corporation? So just curious if anybody has kind of a best practice or a case study around engaging a corporate entity.
Well, we have
answers from the room. Let's hear them. That's great.
I'm Amanda. I'm from Minnesota Orchestra, and our big corporate partners in the Twin Cities called all of the major arts organizations to the table to start having a conversation with us about what we would commit to doing about diversity and inclusion among musicians, staff, and board. So now there's big conversations being had, and now we start to see how that comes down and infiltrates the organization. So we're in the developing process right now. And we just passed a strategic plan, and diversity and inclusion initiatives are within that. So we have a lot of learning, and it's great hearing about the structural racism pieces. My hope is that this will be the next step for our organization, but I'm not at those conversations. My leaders are, so I get very excited when I get filled in on those. But that's what's happening in the Twin Cities.
Anybody else in the room want to give us examples? Yeah.
We just began a process in New York where, because there's so much of the finance industry there, that they have those affinity groups. So there was, I was in dialogue with somebody from Deutsche Bank America's Foundation, just because I happened to know her, and there's apparently a schedule of various financial basic banks getting their affinity groups together for such and such learning day. And I said, well, can we give a presentation about cultural organizations because of this issue of the struggle they have with board diversity and the very real challenge of trying to attract people of color who have the resources to be able to handle a give-get, And these are basically banks' diverse cohorts of employees. So we gave a presentation on, the issue of diversity in the cultural community and said, so, those of you who are, in fact diverse and looking to join nonprofit boards, please consider culture as one of those elements of the nonprofit field. So this was literally the month after last. So this is just beginning now, but it's something we're really excited about. And I think you're exactly right. There are opportunities there for leverage.
Just a comment. My husband is from central Pennsylvania. He's more white than most of the white people here. And I'm the one who had to present him to to music. He loves Baroque, but the symphony is not one of the things that is the most impressive. But I say that it's more exposure, and it's not really, it's you putting yourself in someone else's place, and just people will accept you being a genuine person. I mean, I'm black, but I've been in a white culture pretty much all my life. And when I have to go back into the black community, I have to put myself in the black community's place and know that they're inviting to have culture in their lives, but it's not been a component, particularly here in Baltimore, because they've taken music out of the schools. So they're behind the 8 ball when it comes to really the education component of teaching that, oh my God, it's something I do like, and it gets incorporated with the music that I truly love. I mean, what I used to, for 5 years, buy 2 tickets, 2 season, for every ticket that I bought one for my nephew who was 26 at the time. He can tell me more, he can't tell me the composers' names, but he can tell me the music that he likes. In the same stance, he'll go home and put on his ears and listen to all the hop music or whatever the music is in his life. But diversity, and this is where we truly need to look at diversity on the board level. It's truly, who are the people that you're bringing in? Is it me? Am I the best representation of diversity? Not necessarily. You probably need to go into the communities to determine who are good representatives to teach the board about diversity. And I will help you, but they are the people. And I mean, I live in a pretty diverse county here in Maryland, but we have Indians, we have Asians, and we have blacks, and we have whites. And it's about getting that whole entire community synergized into culture, into music, rather than just looking at the what your effort's going to be. It's like losing weight. Diets don't work, but changing the way of life works.
That's a great way to put it. I also think that, you know, we can't underestimate the complexity of this work and the nuances of it. And talking about, especially if you're white, talking about this in terms of different populations, because we're to the point now with our board is that we did the People's Institute training, and the People's Institute training is very black and white. Literally, very black and white. It's the black story, it's the slavery story, it's the oppression story. They try and make it broader, but it's tough for them because that's really what their message is based on. And the board is now saying, you know, at our last board meeting, we just said when we go through this training again, because they all want to go through another version of the training, we need to look at we need to choose a consultant that is more open to diversity in terms of of what they talk about. And People's Institute is a great place to start. I'm not knocking them. I think they were fantastic, and they gave us the springboard we needed to do something else. Now we've become more complicated. So what do we do with Asian populations, and what do we do with Native American populations, so there's a whole, and how are we addressing and entering those kinds of conversations. So it's a very nuanced and complicated issue, and I think that's true with what we've learned in terms of diversification of boards, for example. That doesn't necessarily mean entry or gateway into a certain community. So. I think I'd rather say instead of trying to look for people of color to be on your board, think about what it is you're really trying to do with the communities you think you want to serve. and go into those communities and know those people and live with that, those what they want, trust them. I mean, it's that's the authentic kind of version of it. So it's, I don't know, it's hard. Authentic is, I'm sorry we're overusing that word a little bit. I'm sorry. Thank you, though, for those comments.
My name is Liz Shergan. I'm with the DC Youth Orchestra Program, and I have a comment and then a question. And the first comment has to do with developing artistic programs that are reflective of your community, and that is our student population is 59% African American, and 2 years ago we did a program that cataloged the civil rights movement in the United States through symphonic music. And after that, our top ensemble actually self-organized and came back and submitted a request of what they would like to see happen more at our institution, and one of which was we want to play more music by African American composers. And so we've spent the last year putting together programs so that they are more interested and more engaged in the work that they're doing. And we're balancing that with some of the symphonic work, and that's been our internal policy. I love the comment about the museum and the laboratory. So I just wanted to throw that out there that, and sometimes when you ask the question, don't even ask the question, your community will come back to you with what they want to see and what they want to hear and be involved in. But I found it very interesting about how every one of the institutions that is represented up on stage tonight did a lot of internal change first in embracing these questions about, structural racism and racial inequity. And I would be very curious to see what the audit for our institution would come back like. So I'm taking that home. But in promoting programs and supporting programs that are about diversity and inclusion within our field at large, what have you seen have been like the most on the external side of things, the resistance and the challenges in general, or things that have tried and not worked out in kind of big picture setting? That makes sense?
I'll speak for Grantmakers and my members. The general issue is one of their boards of trustees. So if you don't have an Earl Lewis, and even at that, so that the changing the culture of an organization, helping to understand what it means to be equitable with certain populations, I think is a very difficult thing. I think for the field that, and particularly for the orchestra field, or any of the major institutions, ballet, opera, and major museums, this idea of legacy and board of trustees, individual support, is a very, it's a very tricky. That's an issue that shouldn't be glided over simply by a CEO saying, "Oh, we can make this change." It needs, you need to bring those people with you, and you need leadership on the board to do it. It's not going to happen, and you'll probably find some resistance there, because and your donors. I think individual donors can be a huge. What does this mean? This means changing. This means where I'm going to come to the concert now. It's going to be hip hop music. When that isn't at all what you're talking about. But that's the initial, there are people who are afraid of that. So I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah. I would say decoupling these conversations from excellence is a worry that needs to be fought at every level, and that this is additive rather than exclusionary. That's one point I want to make. I think another, speaking from personal experience, the fellowship work that has been done at American Orchestras, and Jesse, I think, has alluded a couple of times to the report that the League is about to publish, that so much of this work has been done in isolation at a few orchestras, and that the recipients of these fellows have gone on to do great things, but we are not serving them by keeping them in isolation. So when we talk about best practices, I think expanding those activities and the networking that is happening between and among them, and providing mentorship to help them navigate through these challenging parts of change so that they can be musicians and not merely ambassadors and proselytizers is something we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one, it's been touched upon, the idea that these efforts are a discrete program, which can be so easily sort of fall away. And then the other is, when you're doing otherwise and saying, no, this is actually a larger change, the fact of the matter is, on a basic emotional level, most of us experience change as loss, regardless of whether the change is good or bad. Most of us experience it as loss, and on a certain level it is, because you are losing part of your past and you're losing part of what you were. And we have to recognize that and honor that, because otherwise we're going to, without thinking, just cling to what was.
We have time for one more question, and here it is.
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. I was just wondering if you could speak to at all the idea of, I feel like with a lot of these initiatives, they're so targeted at a minority group, but I worry a little bit about sort of that separate but equal sort of thing happening. And, to your point about not creating this separate group in isolation or an individual in isolation, how do we really integrate this sort of group of diverse candidates into a culture that's existing in a way that, then it's a really true kind of rainbow reflection rather than, these isolated groups. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I unless I'm misinterpreting, or put it this way, this is just one approach. One of the things that we do at the agency, which I would love to take credit for, has nothing to do with me at all. It's a long-standing practice, has been just giving away some of our power, that is to say, through the panel process. And, I'm sorry. So looking at, the issue of equity within our grantee portfolio, those chosen by the panel process among some of our recipients who receive the largest amount of money through the panel process are a lot of our culturally explicit organizations, right? This isn't something that is a program for culturally explicit organizations. This is simply our grant-making program. And the way we've achieved this largely was by looking at the diversity of our panelists. This isn't necessarily a staff intervention beyond our design of the program so that the staff is not actually making these choices. So we don't have a program that's specifically for culturally explicit organizations. But we do have a process where that allows us to be, we hope, and hope increasingly so, equitable.
I just want to say, I think it also is a matter of involving the various components of your own institution and achieving buy-in and assuaging fears. At the fellows meeting we were at earlier this morning, the fellow at your orchestra actually said that it was the subs in the orchestra who were most concerned and said, are you taking work away from us? And he said, no, if there are 10 subs on a week, I'm number 11. And that's a very simple conversation that, if it's not had in advance, can lead to distrust, misunderstanding. And I think one of the things that came out of the earlier session was we need to do a better job about onboarding these positions and helping the field with what are those questions, how do you answer them?
I just want to say that was great points. The other issue that happens that's happening in the field right now, in terms of Alana organizations and Alana artists, is their feeling that large organizations have received money for years, decades, to diversify, grow their audience, however you want it, whatever you want, audience development, however you want to call it. And oftentimes those programs have included a partnership with these small organizations, African American theaters or music groups or Latino dance companies or whatever it is. and that the partnership has never been a fair one. So they get a large grant. The large organization, because of its large budget, gets a large grant to do some diversification work. They contract with the culturally explicit organizations in their community to help. They pay them a little contractual fee, and then and so somebody's kind of the loser here, and it generally is the smaller organization who didn't get their overhead paid, who probably didn't really charge them enough money out of this grant project. Anyway, so there's this disparity about if in fact for 40 years diversity hasn't been working over here in large organizations, then maybe some of that money needs to go to these other groups. So if there are partnerships, and if you turn to your own community to say, what other artists are working in this community that we can work with, I would just ask you to make sure that you think you think about their needs and helping to support their organizations. That will help strengthen the diversity of your entire community. So.
Yeah, and I would say that it behooves funders, when they're thinking about diversity, to fund the full diversity of the organizations and the artists in their communities with equal kinds of support, be it operating support or whatever, and because that's how you really build a whole ecosystem. Thank you all for your excellent questions and comments, and please thank our panel.